Beneath the freezing storms and dark streets of Gotham City exists one villain whose story feels less like the rise of evil and more like the slow death of a broken human soul. Before he became Mr. Freeze, Victor Freeze was a brilliant scientist, a lonely man, and a husband desperately trying to save the only person who ever brought warmth into his life. But somewhere between love, grief, corporate betrayal, and obsession, that desperate man transformed into one of Batman's most tragic enemies. This is not simply a story about ice weapons and frozen crimes. It is the story of how Gotham destroys wounded people, how grief can consume identity, and how love itself can slowly become something dangerous when a person refuses to let go of the past. Gotham's coldest tragedy begins. There are many criminals hiding within the endless shadows of Gotham City, figures remembered for cruelty, madness, greed, or chaos. Yet among all the enemies who have crossed paths with Batman, few inspire the same quiet sadness as Mr. Freeze. Because unlike Gotham's most violent monsters, Victor Freeze was not born from hatred or a desire to spread suffering across the city. He did not seek power for pleasure. He did not laugh while innocent people suffered, and he did not dream of watching Gotham burn simply to satisfy his own twisted amusement. Instead, his story began with something painfully human: love. And perhaps that is what makes his tragedy feel colder than almost anything else inside Gotham's endless darkness. Because Mr. Freeze is not simply the story of a villain becoming evil. It is the story of grief slowly freezing a human soul from the inside until love itself becomes transformed into obsession. Long before Gotham feared the sight of blue light glowing through frozen alleyways or the sound of ice spreading across steel and concrete, Victor Freeze was only a scientist, intelligent, quiet, emotionally distant perhaps, but still human. Somewhere beneath the snow-covered crimes and cryogenic weapons existed a man who once believed science could save lives rather than destroy them. That forgotten humanity matters deeply, because Gotham often creates villains who seem almost impossible to understand emotionally. Figures like the Joker, whose minds appear consumed entirely by chaos and cruelty. Mr. Freeze feels different from them. When people look into Victor Freeze's story carefully, they do not see a monster enjoying destruction. They see loneliness. They see exhaustion. They see heartbreak stretched so far beyond ordinary grief that it eventually becomes something frightening. And Gotham itself seems strangely suited for such tragedy. The city has always carried a coldness beyond weather alone, a feeling lingering between towering buildings and empty streets long after midnight, when fog rolls across the pavement and pale lights reflect against wet concrete. Gotham is a place where emotional warmth struggles to survive for long. Families collapse there. Hope fades quietly. Kind people grow tired. The city slowly drains softness from people until survival itself becomes difficult enough. Mr. Freeze belongs perfectly within that atmosphere. Even before understanding his origins fully, there is something haunting about him moving through Gotham's darkness. His presence feels silent compared to other villains. No wild laughter echoes behind him. No theatrical speeches fill the air. Instead, there is only stillness, cold air spreading slowly outward while frost crawls across walls and windows like winter, swallowing the city piece by piece. And somewhere beneath that frozen armor walks a man already emotionally dead in many ways, long before Batman ever confronted him. That emotional emptiness became one of the central mysteries surrounding Victor Freeze for years. How does someone become this? How does a brilliant scientist transform into a figure incapable of surviving ordinary temperatures, hidden forever inside refrigerated armor while carrying weapons capable of turning human beings into frozen statues? The answer is painful, precisely because it feels understandable, not justified, but understandable, because Victor Freeze's story is built around one terrifying emotional truth, namely, that grief can change people beyond recognition if left alone long enough inside darkness. Most people experience loss and somehow continue moving forward eventually, even while carrying scars. They mourn, they suffer, they slowly rebuild parts of themselves over time. But Gotham has a way of trapping people emotionally inside the worst moments of their lives. Instead of healing pain, the city often deepens it until suffering becomes identity itself. Victor Freeze represents one of the clearest examples of this transformation. The world eventually came to know him as Mr. Freeze, yet that name itself reveals something tragic immediately. He stopped being seen as a man first. He became defined entirely by coldness, by the accident, by the frozen condition trapping him away from ordinary humanity forever. Somewhere along the way, Victor Freeze disappeared beneath grief, science, and obsession until even his own identity seemed preserved in ice like everything else surrounding him. And at the center of that frozen world remained one person, Nora Freeze. Even before audiences learn every detail about Nora, her presence hangs over Victor's story constantly, like snowfall drifting through Gotham at night. She is the reason behind everything, every crime, every experiment, every desperate act, every frozen chamber, glowing quietly in hidden laboratories beneath the city. Nothing surrounding Mr. Freeze can be understood without understanding that somewhere inside all the ice and emotional numbness exists a man terrified of losing the only warmth he ever truly had. That is why Mr. Freeze often feels less like a conqueror and more like someone trapped inside mourning that never ends. Most villains chase future desires, wealth, control, revenge, domination, chaos. Victor Freeze chases the past. He tries preserving something already slipping away from him emotionally. Every frozen room, every cryogenic machine, every scientific breakthrough becomes another desperate attempt to stop time itself before grief fully consumes him. And perhaps that is why his story feels so heavy. Because there is something deeply human about refusing to let go. Almost everyone understands the fear of losing someone they love. Most people know what it feels like to wish time would stop during certain moments before illness, distance, or death takes something precious away forever. Victor Freeze simply carried that fear further than anyone else until it transformed him completely. Gotham encouraged that transformation too. The city rarely helps wounded people heal properly. Instead, it surrounds suffering with corruption, greed, emotional isolation, and endless pressure until vulnerable individuals slowly collapse beneath the weight of their pain. Gotham does not create monsters from nothing. It takes damaged people and pushes them further into darkness, one terrible decision at a time. Victor Freeze was vulnerable long before becoming Mr. Freeze. He was intelligent but emotionally distant, brilliant but isolated. People like Victor often struggle connecting with the world naturally because they feel safer around systems, machines, formulas, and predictable scientific truths than complicated human emotions. Science gave Victor control in ways ordinary life could not, but love changed him. Love gave him something fragile enough to fear losing, and fear is dangerous inside Gotham. Because fear eventually pushes people toward desperation if they believe the world is taking away the only thing keeping them emotionally alive. That desperation sits at the center of Mr. Freeze's tragedy. When Gotham's other villains commit crimes, they often appear emotionally energized by destruction. Freeze rarely does. His actions usually feel cold, exhausted, almost mechanical, like someone moving through grief on automatic survival instinct rather than genuine cruelty. Even during violent confrontations, there remains something distant about him, as though part of Victor Freeze already exists somewhere far away emotionally beside Nora, rather than fully present within the crimes themselves. Batman notices this difference too. Unlike enemies driven by chaos or sadism, Mr. Freeze often carries sadness, visible beneath the armor. Batman sees a man trapped inside loss, rather than someone enjoying suffering for its own sake. That distinction matters, because Bruce Wayne understands grief intimately after losing his own parents as a child. He recognizes the emotional shape of obsession formed through trauma. The difference is that Bruce transformed grief into Batman, Victor Fry's transformed grief into ice. Both men lost themselves in the process. And perhaps that is why Mr. Freeze remains one of Gotham's most haunting figures. He reflects what can happen when love becomes consumed entirely by fear of loss. At first, Victor's actions likely felt reasonable to him. Save Nora, continue researching, push ethical boundaries slightly further, break rules if necessary, take risks because time is running out. But desperation changes morality slowly, especially when someone convinces themselves every terrible action serves love. That is the frightening emotional paradox hidden inside Mr. Freeze's story. The same devotion making him sympathetic also drives him toward increasingly dangerous choices. Victor Fries does not stop because stopping means accepting loss emotionally, and he cannot survive that acceptance psychologically, so the ice spreads further, the crimes escalate, the emotional isolation deepens. And somewhere along the way, the brilliant scientist who once wanted to save life becomes feared throughout Gotham as a villain carrying winter wherever he walks. Still, even after everything, there remains something profoundly tragic about him standing alone inside frozen laboratories while snow gathers against the windows outside. Unlike villains surrounded by followers or chaos, Mr. Freeze often appears isolated completely, separated from ordinary human warmth by both physical condition and emotional devastation. He exists between life and death emotionally, between love and obsession, between humanity and numbness. And perhaps the saddest part of all is that somewhere beneath the cold armor, Victor Fries may still remember exactly what warmth once felt like, which only makes the frozen silence surrounding him even more unbearable. Because Mr. Freeze's story is not truly about ice. It is about what happens when grief becomes so overwhelming that a person would rather freeze the entire world than endure the pain of letting someone go forever. Victor Fries, before the ice, long before the people of Gotham City whispered the name Mr. Freeze with fear whenever winter storms rolled across the city, Victor Fries was simply a quiet boy standing at a distance from the world around him, watching life more often than participating in it. Even as a child, there was something emotionally different about Victor, something cold, not in cruelty, but in the way he struggled connecting naturally with other people. While other children formed friendships easily, played loudly, argued, laughed, and moved through life with emotional warmth that seemed effortless, Victor often appeared separated from those experiences by invisible glass. He observed more than he spoke, he studied more than he played, and he found comfort in things that behaved predictably. Machines made sense to him, scientific laws made sense. Temperatures, chemical reactions, biological systems, and mathematical structures followed rules that human emotions often did not. For Victor Fries, the world of science felt safer than the world of people, because science did not betray expectations emotionally. If something broke, there was usually a reason. If something failed, there was a pattern hidden somewhere waiting to be understood. Human beings felt far more confusing. Different versions of Victor's early life reveal loneliness in different ways, yet almost every interpretation carries the same emotional truth beneath it. Victor struggled emotionally with connection from an early age. Some stories describe distant or emotionally cold parents. Others suggest isolation caused partly by Victor's own personality and intellectual intensity. Whatever the exact details, the result remains similar. Victor grew up feeling separated from ordinary emotional life, almost like someone watching humanity from outside, rather than fully belonging within it. This emotional distance shaped his personality quietly over time. Teachers recognized his intelligence quickly because Victor learned at unusual speed, especially in subjects connected to biology, chemistry, and physics. While many students lost focus during difficult lessons, Victor became more absorbed the more complicated a subject appeared. Scientific research did not exhaust him emotionally the way social interaction often did. In laboratories and libraries, surrounded by quiet and structure, Victor felt calm in ways the outside world rarely allowed. But intelligence can become isolating too. The more Victor focused on science, the further he drifted emotionally from people his own age. Conversations felt shallow to him. Social expectations seemed confusing or unnecessary, while others formed emotional bonds through shared experiences and spontaneous interaction. Victor built walls around himself, almost without realizing it. Over time, solitude became familiar enough that he stopped questioning it. And yet beneath that isolation remained something fragile. Because Victor Fries was not emotionless, he was emotionally cautious. There is an important difference between those things. People often mistook Victor's quiet personality for coldness long before he ever became Mr. Freeze. But inside him existed enormous sensitivity hidden beneath restraint and discomfort. He felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply, yet struggled expressing those emotions naturally. Instead of opening himself emotionally to others, Victor directed his energy toward research and observation where feelings could remain controlled rather than exposed. That pattern eventually shaped his fascination with preservation itself. Even as a young scientist, Victor became deeply interested in cryogenics and low-temperature research, fields focused on slowing decay, protecting fragile biological structures, and preserving life under impossible conditions. To outsiders, this fascination may have looked unusual or even strange, but emotionally, it reflected something important about Victor's inner world. He feared loss. Science became his attempt to fight against destruction itself. Most people accept change and mortality gradually because emotional connection teaches them how to process grief over time. Victor Fries never learned emotional adaptation naturally in the same way. He preferred stability, control, and predictability. The idea that beautiful or fragile things could disappear permanently disturbed him deeply. Cryogenics therefore represented more than scientific curiosity. It represented hope against loss, the possibility that science might preserve what ordinary life could not. That idea consumed Victor increasingly as he grew older. While other researchers focused on fame, profit, or corporate advancement, Victor became obsessed with preservation itself, especially the preservation of living tissue under extreme conditions. He spent endless hours studying how cold temperatures slowed biological decay and suspended cellular damage. The work required extraordinary patience, precision, and attention to detail, qualities Victor possessed naturally. Inside cold laboratories filled with quiet machinery humming softly beneath fluorescent lights, Victor felt strangely peaceful. Coldness comforted him. Not emotionally at first, but structurally. Cold environments slowed movement, reduced chaos, created stillness. Ice preserved fragile things, carefully, in ways heat could not. To Victor, freezing represented protection rather than death, and perhaps even then, long before tragedy fully entered his life, part of him already feared the emotional instability of the outside world deeply enough to seek safety within stillness itself. This emotional isolation affected his relationships constantly. Victor struggled forming close friendships because ordinary social interaction exhausted him in ways scientific work never did. He often appeared distant during conversations, distracted by thoughts others could not see. People around him sensed the emotional barrier separating Victor from the rest of the world, though few understood it completely. Some viewed him as arrogant because of his intelligence. Others simply found him strange. The truth was sadder. Victor Fries wanted connection more than many realized, but he rarely understood how to build it safely. Human relationships require vulnerability, unpredictability, compromise, and emotional openness. All things Victor found difficult to navigate naturally. Research felt easier because experiments followed structure. Human beings did not. Over time, Victor built his identity around intellect rather than emotional intimacy. He became known for scientific brilliance, precision, and discipline. Yet, beneath those accomplishments lingered enormous loneliness. While other people built families, friendships, and social lives, Victor spent increasing amounts of time inside laboratories, academic institutions, and research facilities where he could focus entirely on work without confronting emotional discomfort directly. And Gotham encouraged this isolation further. Gotham City has always been a place where emotionally distant people disappear easily into work, ambition, and obsession, because the city itself often feels emotionally cold beneath its endless storms and towering architecture. Gotham rewards intensity while quietly neglecting emotional well-being. Scientists, executives, politicians, and criminals alike often lose themselves inside purpose until relationships begin collapsing around them unnoticed. Victor fit perfectly into that environment. He became someone who understood machines better than people, someone who trusted data more than conversation, someone who felt safer inside research than ordinary human life. And yet, despite everything, there remained something deeply fragile about him emotionally. Because loneliness does not remove the need for love. It only makes that need quieter and more difficult to express. Victor Fries spent years living beside emotional emptiness without fully understanding how deeply isolated he had become. Research filled his time. Scientific goals gave him structure. But beneath all the work lingered silence, waiting to be broken by someone capable of reaching him emotionally. That possibility seemed almost impossible for someone like Victor, until eventually someone did. But before that warmth entered his life, Victor already carried the psychological foundation that would later shape his tragedy completely. His fear of loss, obsession with preservation, emotional restraint, and discomfort with human vulnerability all existed long before becoming Mr. Freeze. The accident that transformed him physically only amplified qualities already growing inside him quietly for years. That is what makes Victor Freeze's story so tragic. The frozen villain Gotham later feared did not emerge suddenly from nowhere. The loneliness existed first. The emotional isolation existed first. The obsession with preserving fragile things existed first. Even the coldness existed first in subtle ways, hidden inside laboratory walls and quiet rooms where Victor Freeze slowly withdrew from ordinary life, while convincing himself science alone could provide meaning strong enough to replace emotional connection. And perhaps the saddest part is that many people around him likely never noticed how vulnerable he truly was beneath the intelligence and distance. Society often praises brilliant minds while overlooking the emotional isolation surrounding them. Victor became respected for his research while quietly drifting further away from ordinary human warmth each year. By the time tragedy finally arrived fully into his life, Victor Freeze already stood dangerously alone, emotionally. He had knowledge, he had discipline, he had purpose, but he had almost no emotional protection against grief, powerful enough to shatter the carefully controlled world he spent his entire life building around himself. And somewhere inside cold laboratories glowing softly beneath Gotham's endless nights, Victor Freeze continued studying how to preserve life against impossible odds, never realizing that one day he would become the very thing he spent years trying to understand. A fragile existence trapped forever between survival and emotional death, preserved in cold silence long after warmth had already begun slipping away. Nora, the only warmth in his life, before the frozen laboratories, before the armored suit, before the people of Gotham City began fearing the cold blue glow surrounding Mr. Freeze, there was a quiet period in Victor Freeze's life where the world briefly felt warmer, softer, and more human than it ever had before, because for the first time since childhood, Victor encountered someone capable of reaching through the emotional distance surrounding him and making him feel less alone inside himself. That person was Nora Freeze. To many people, Nora may appear at first like a tragic figure existing mainly within the background of Victor's story, the sleeping woman preserved inside frozen chambers, while Gotham remembers her name, mostly through grief and obsession. But to Victor Freeze, Nora was never simply part of his life. She became the center of it. And perhaps that is why losing her would eventually destroy him so completely. Because before Nora entered Victor's world, He moved through life like someone emotionally disconnected from ordinary warmth. He understood science more easily than conversation. He trusted machines more than people. His days were structured around laboratories, research notes, temperature readings, and scientific theories, rather than emotional intimacy or companionship. Then Nora arrived quietly into that silence. Different versions of their story describe their meeting in different ways, yet what remains consistent is the emotional transformation she created within Victor almost immediately. Nora possessed something Victor lacked naturally: emotional openness without fear. Where Victor approached life cautiously and analytically, Nora carried warmth effortlessly. She spoke gently. She listened carefully. She treated Victor not like a strange scientist hiding behind cold professionalism, but like a human being worthy of patience and understanding. That difference changed him slowly. At first, Victor likely struggled, expressing himself around her in ordinary ways, because emotional closeness remained unfamiliar territory for someone who spent much of his life protecting himself through distance. Yet Nora did not seem frightened by his quiet nature. She did not mock his awkwardness or impatience with social rituals. Instead, she understood that beneath Victor's reserved personality existed enormous sensitivity hidden carefully beneath years of isolation. For perhaps the first time in his life, Victor Fries felt emotionally seen. That feeling mattered more than almost anything else. People who spend years isolated often begin believing connection itself may simply not exist for them. They convince themselves loneliness is permanent or natural. Victor likely expected to spend most of his life inside research facilities and cold laboratories, respected perhaps for his intelligence, but never truly understood personally by anyone around him. Nora changed that expectation completely. With her, conversation became easier. Silence became peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Even ordinary moments carried emotional warmth Victor rarely experienced before, and Gotham itself seemed different around her. This detail matters deeply because Gotham normally feels emotionally oppressive, a city where rain, fear, corruption, and exhaustion slowly wear people down over time, until even happiness begins feeling temporary. Yet during Victor and Nora's life together, there existed a brief period where Gotham's darkness faded into the background, not because the city changed, but because love changed how Victor experienced it. For someone emotionally isolated most of his life, companionship itself felt almost miraculous. Simple things most people take for granted became deeply meaningful to Victor because they represented emotional safety he never truly possessed before. Shared dinners, quiet conversations late at night, reading beside one another while rain tapped softly against apartment windows, walking through Gotham streets no longer feeling entirely alone among the crowds. These moments mattered profoundly, because Victor Fries did not simply fall in love with Nora romantically. He built an emotional home around her presence. Nora gave structure and meaning to parts of life Victor once ignored entirely. Before her, research often existed as escape from emotional uncertainty. After meeting Nora, science slowly became connected to hope, future, and protection instead. Victor no longer researched merely because intellectual discovery fascinated him. He wanted to build a life with someone he genuinely loved, and perhaps even more importantly, Nora helped Victor reconnect with his own humanity. That may sound strange when describing someone who later becomes Mr. Freeze, yet it is essential to understanding his tragedy fully. Nora softened parts of Victor emotionally that had remained frozen long before the accident ever occurred. She reminded him how to care beyond scientific obsession. She encouraged emotional vulnerability gently rather than forcing it. Around her, Victor no longer needed to hide completely inside intellect and control. There was tenderness in their relationship, often missing from Gotham's darker stories. Not dramatic passion, not theatrical romance, something quieter, softer, the kind of connection built through patience and emotional trust rather than chaos or intensity. Victor loved Nora carefully, deeply, almost reverently, and Nora loved him, despite the emotional barriers he still carried. She understood his silences. She understood how difficult emotional expression could become for him sometimes. Most importantly, she never made him feel broken for struggling with things other people seem to do naturally. That acceptance became life-changing. Because loneliness often convinces people they are fundamentally unworthy of connection, Nora shattered that belief for Victor. Through her presence, he experienced emotional peace, perhaps for the first time in his life. And in many ways, that peace became fragile, precisely because it mattered so much. Victor Fries built his emotional world around Nora completely because she represented the one place where his mind and heart both felt calm simultaneously. Science gave him purpose intellectually, but Nora gave him purpose emotionally. Together, they created something fragile and beautiful inside Gotham's endless darkness, a small warmth surrounded by coldness. That image would later become painfully symbolic, because when people lose ordinary happiness after never expecting to find it in the first place, grief often strikes with terrifying intensity. Victor did not simply love Nora. He needed her emotionally in ways he barely understood himself. This emotional dependence grew stronger over time because Victor remained naturally isolated from most other people. Nora became his closest companion, his emotional anchor, the person standing between him and complete loneliness. While other couples built social circles and broader emotional support systems, Victor and Nora's world often seemed quieter and more private. There is something hauntingly gentle about imagining them during those years. Victor returning home exhausted from research, while Nora waits quietly beside warm lights inside their apartment. Snow falling softly outside Gotham windows while they talk about the future. Nora reading through Victor's research notes, not because she fully understands every scientific detail, but because she wants to understand him. Victor slowly smiling more around her than around anyone else. Moments small enough that most people would overlook them entirely. Yet for Victor Fries, these moments became everything. And perhaps that is why Gotham's darkness feels strangely distant during this part of the story. For once, tragedy has not fully arrived yet. The city still carries corruption, violence, and emotional exhaustion beneath the surface. But Victor and Nora exist temporarily inside a fragile shelter, built from companionship strong enough to keep Gotham's coldness outside for a little while longer. Batman's world rarely allows such peace to survive forever. Still, its existence matters because it proves Victor Fries was never naturally monstrous. He was capable of tenderness, capable of devotion, capable of emotional warmth when someone reached him with patience rather than fear or judgment. Nora brought those qualities out of him naturally, and that makes what happens later infinitely more tragic. Because when people discuss Mr. Freeze as a villain, they often focus on the ice weapons, the robberies, the frozen crimes, and the terrifying armor. But beneath all of that remains the memory of a man quietly holding the hand of the woman he loved while Gotham's noise faded into the distance around them. That memory never truly disappears from Victor Fries. Even after everything, even after the cold consumes his life completely, Nora remains emotionally connected to the last version of Victor, who still felt fully human. She represents warmth itself within his story. Not merely physical warmth, but emotional warmth, trust, companionship, safety, and peace. When Victor later surrounds himself with ice and freezing temperatures, part of the horror comes from understanding that he once lived inside something emotionally opposite to all of that, and he lost it. Or perhaps, more accurately, he became terrified of losing it. That fear would eventually grow large enough to consume every other part of his identity. But before grief transformed love into obsession, before Gotham turned another wounded soul into something tragic and frightening, there existed a brief period where Victor Fries simply loved Nora quietly, while believing the future still held something gentle waiting for them both beyond the city's endless storms. For a little while, Gotham's coldness could not reach them, and for a man like Victor Fries, That small warmth meant more than the entire world, the illness that changed everything. There are moments in life when everything changes so quietly at first that people do not immediately realize the future has already begun collapsing around them. And for Victor Fries, that moment arrived not through violence, explosions, or some dramatic disaster beneath the dark skyline of Gotham City, but through illness, through the slow and terrifying realization that the one person who brought warmth into his isolated world might soon disappear forever. At first, the signs likely seemed small: fatigue, moments of weakness, subtle symptoms easy to dismiss during ordinary life. But illnesses of this kind rarely remain hidden forever, especially not from someone like Victor Fries, whose entire mind had been trained to notice details, patterns, and biological irregularities with obsessive precision. While others may have overlooked certain warning signs temporarily, Victor would have studied them carefully almost immediately. And somewhere deep inside himself, fear began growing long before the official diagnosis ever arrived. Because scientists understand fragility differently than most people, Victor spent years studying preservation, biological failure, and the limits of human survival. He understood how delicate life truly was beneath the surface. He knew cells break down. He knew bodies fail. He knew medicine has limits no matter how advanced technology becomes. Yet knowing these truths scientifically did not prepare him emotionally for the possibility of losing Nora Fries. When the diagnosis finally came, it likely felt unreal at first. Terminal illness has a way of transforming ordinary rooms into places people remember forever. A doctor's office, a hospital hallway, the sound of papers moving softly across a desk while someone explains survival rates, treatment possibilities, and words nobody ever expects to hear, connected to the person they love most. Victor Fries heard those words differently than most people. Other families might cry immediately, search for emotional comfort, or cling to hope through faith and support from loved ones. Victor's mind moved somewhere else almost instantly, toward solutions, toward calculations, toward research, toward the impossible question already beginning to consume him completely. How do you stop death itself? That question became the center of Victor's existence from that moment forward. At first, his response probably seemed understandable, even admirable. He refused to surrender. He searched for treatments aggressively. He buried himself inside scientific literature, experimental medicine, cryogenic theory, biological preservation, and every possible avenue that might save Nora's life. Hospitals, specialists, pharmaceutical research, private laboratories, and medical databases slowly replaced the ordinary rhythms of daily life. And Nora watched all of this happen with growing sadness. Because she understood something Victor could not fully accept emotionally. Sometimes love cannot prevent loss. That truth terrified Victor more than anything else in the world. For most of his life, science gave Victor Fries a sense of control over uncertainty. Problems could be studied, variables could be managed, systems could be improved through patience and intellect. Even difficult situations carried solutions somewhere if someone worked hard enough and understood enough. But terminal illness does not behave like a machine waiting to be repaired. It moves slowly and cruelly through ordinary life, changing everything piece by piece, while leaving just enough hope alive to prevent emotional acceptance completely. Victor watched Nora weaken gradually, while still smiling at him gently. He saw moments where she tried comforting him, even while suffering herself, and that helplessness began destroying him internally. Because Victor Fries was not emotionally equipped to accept helplessness. His entire personality revolved around solving problems through knowledge, discipline, and careful control. Losing Nora represented something unbearable, a situation where intelligence alone might not be enough. Every day that passed without a cure deepened the fear growing inside him. That fear slowly transformed into obsession. At first, Victor likely still maintained ethical boundaries in his work. He followed legal research procedures, sought legitimate funding, worked through approved scientific channels. But Gotham has a way of exhausting good intentions over time, especially when someone becomes desperate enough. And desperation changes morality quietly before people fully notice it happening. The more Victor watched Nora suffer, the less patient he became with limitations imposed by institutions, ethics boards, corporate regulations, and medical bureaucracy. To ordinary people, these systems exist for safety and accountability. To Victor, they increasingly began looking like obstacles, standing between Nora and survival. That emotional shift mattered enormously, because once someone starts viewing rules as barriers to saving a loved one, breaking those rules begins feeling morally justified instead of dangerous. Victor convinced himself he was not acting selfishly. He was trying to save her. And that belief became powerful enough to override nearly everything else. The tragedy is that his love remained genuine throughout all of this. Victor did not pursue science for greed or power. Every sleepless night inside laboratories, every desperate experiment, every obsessive calculation came from terror at the thought of living in a world without Nora beside him. But love mixed with panic can become dangerous, especially for someone as intelligent and emotionally isolated as Victor Fries. Because the more desperate he became, the more science transformed emotionally from hope into fixation. Research no longer represented curiosity or progress alone. It became survival itself. Every failed experiment felt catastrophic. Every setback felt personal. Every delay carried emotional horror because time itself had become the enemy. And time was winning. Nora's condition continued worsening, while Victor spiraled deeper into obsession, trying to stop what felt inevitable. Sleep became less important. Food became secondary. Conversations outside research likely faded almost entirely from his life. Gotham disappeared around him emotionally because Victor's world narrowed down to laboratories, medical data, frozen preservation techniques, and the woman slowly slipping away despite everything he tried. There is something deeply heartbreaking about imagining Nora during this period, not because she stopped loving Victor, but because she probably watched him losing himself while trying to save her. That is one of the cruelest parts of Mr. Freeze's story. Victor's desperation came from love, yet the deeper he fell into obsession, the further he drifted emotionally from the peaceful humanity Nora originally brought into his life. The gentle man who once found quiet happiness beside her gradually transformed into someone consumed entirely by fear of losing her. Fear replaced warmth, panic replaced peace, and science replaced nearly everything else. Still, Victor continued believing he could fix things somehow if he worked hard enough. That belief became emotionally addictive, because accepting failure meant accepting death, and Victor Fries could not do that. Not after spending his life believing preservation was possible. Not after finally finding emotional connection in a world where he spent years alone. Not after building his entire future around Nora's existence. This is where Gotham's influence becomes important once again. A healthier city might have offered emotional support, compassion, or systems capable of helping someone like Victor before obsession consumed him entirely. Gotham instead surrounded him with corporate greed, emotional coldness, and institutions more concerned with profit than human suffering. Research funding became political. Medical breakthroughs became business opportunities. Human life became secondary to financial interests. Victor grew increasingly isolated inside that environment, and isolation intensifies obsession. Without emotional grounding from friends, community, or healthy support systems, Victor had only his own mind, reflecting fear back at him endlessly. The more frightened he became, the more aggressively he pursued impossible solutions. The more impossible the situation appeared, the further he withdrew into scientific obsession as protection against grief. Because deep down, Victor understood something horrifying. If Nora died, he did not know who he would become afterward. She represented the emotional center of his life. Without her, all the loneliness he carried before meeting her would return stronger than ever. The coldness surrounding his personality, long before becoming Mr. Freeze waited quietly beneath the surface, ready to consume him completely if Nora disappeared. Perhaps part of Victor sensed this unconsciously. Perhaps that is why he fought so desperately against the inevitable, not only to save Nora, but to save himself from the emptiness waiting beyond her loss. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, morality began collapsing beneath that fear. Ethical boundaries weakened, scientific caution faded. The line between healing and obsession blurred further each day. Victor Fries still believed he was acting out of love, and in many ways he was. But love alone no longer guided his decisions safely anymore. Panic had entered the equation now. Terror had entered it. The desperate refusal to let go had begun reshaping his entire identity. Science became both salvation and prison simultaneously. It gave Victor hope when nothing else could, but it also trapped him inside endless pursuit of impossible control over death itself. And perhaps that was the moment tragedy truly began. Not the accident later, not the frozen armor, not the crimes Gotham would eventually fear, but the quiet transformation of a grieving scientist into someone willing to sacrifice everything, morality, humanity, and eventually even himself, for the chance to keep one fragile heartbeat alive just a little longer against the cold silence waiting patiently ahead. GothCorp and corporate betrayal. As Victor Fries sank deeper into desperation trying to save Nora Fries from the illness slowly consuming her life, he entered a world far colder than any laboratory he had ever worked inside before. The corporate world of GothCorp, where human suffering mattered only when it could be transformed into profit, influence, or technological advancement useful to powerful people, sitting safely above Gotham's endless misery. GothCorp stood like many enormous institutions throughout Gotham City, polished on the surface, respected publicly, and deeply rotten underneath. From the outside, the company appeared innovative and sophisticated, a symbol of scientific progress rising above Gotham's violence and corruption through advanced research, pharmaceutical development, and technological investment. Wealthy executives spoke confidently about improving the future. Press conferences celebrated breakthroughs. Investors praised growth and expansion. But inside the company's walls, human lives often became numbers before they remained people, and Victor Fries slowly learned that truth in the most painful way imaginable. At first, GothCorp likely seemed like salvation. Victor needed resources far beyond what ordinary medical institutions could provide. Nora's condition demanded experimental research, expensive equipment, cryogenic technology, and scientific freedom that smaller laboratories simply could not support properly. GothCorp possessed funding, facilities, connections, and political influence capable of pushing research into areas most institutions considered too risky or unprofitable. To Victor, the company represented possibility, a chance to save Nora before time disappeared completely. And people like Ferris Boyle understood that desperation immediately. Ferris Boyle embodied a particular kind of Gotham corruption, the polished corporate predator hiding greed beneath professionalism and charm. Unlike Gotham's street criminals who threatened people openly through violence, Boyle operated through contracts, manipulation, legal authority, and financial control. Men like him rarely dirtied their own hands directly because institutions protected them far more effectively than guns ever could. Boyle looked at Victor Fries and saw opportunity, not tragedy, not love, not a terrified husband trying to save the only person who gave his life meaning. He saw valuable research. He saw cryogenic technology with enormous commercial and military potential. He saw patents, profits, and influence waiting beneath Victor's desperation. That emotional disconnect became central to Victor's downfall, because while Victor approached science through fear of loss and emotional urgency, GothCorp approached science through corporate calculation. To Victor, Nora's survival represented everything. To GothCorp executives, Nora was secondary to what Victor's research might become financially. This difference poisoned the entire relationship from the beginning. Victor likely ignored warning signs at first, because desperation narrows moral vision dangerously. When someone believes a loved one's life depends on success, compromise becomes easier to justify emotionally. GothCorp offered resources. Victor needed those resources, so he tolerated corporate oversight, executive interference, and growing pressure surrounding his work, because failure felt impossible to accept. Meanwhile, Ferris Boyle continued tightening control carefully. Corporate exploitation rarely begins dramatically. It happens slowly through dependency. The more Victor relied on GothCorp's laboratories and funding, the more vulnerable he became to the company's demands. Research schedules intensified. Oversight increased. Financial concerns entered conversations that should have remained focused on human life. Yet, Victor kept pushing forward because Nora's condition continued worsening. That urgency made him easier to manipulate. People in power often exploit desperation precisely because frightened individuals become willing to sacrifice boundaries they would normally defend. Victor stopped thinking like an independent scientist gradually and began operating like someone trapped inside survival mode emotionally. Boyle understood this perfectly. Executives like Ferris Boyle thrive inside systems where human emotion becomes weakness to exploit. Compassion slows profit. Ethical hesitation complicates business. The corporate world surrounding Gotham rewarded efficiency, ambition, and financial success far more than empathy. In that environment, Victor Fries became useful primarily because his suffering motivated him to produce results at dangerous speed. And perhaps the cruelest part was that Victor initially believed GothCorp genuinely wanted to help. That belief reflected his remaining innocence emotionally. Despite his isolation and obsession, Victor still hoped institutions built around science and medicine might value human life enough to support his work sincerely. He wanted to believe intelligence, research, and technological advancement existed partly to reduce suffering. GothCorp shattered that hope slowly. The company became increasingly focused on ownership and profitability surrounding Victor's cryogenic breakthroughs. Instead of seeing the research as a means to save Nora, executives saw future markets and military applications. Cryogenic preservation could generate enormous revenue. Patents connected to Victor's work promised power far beyond medical treatment alone, and the more valuable the research became, the less Victor himself mattered. This is one of the darkest truths about Gotham's corporate world. People are often valued only while useful. Once they become inconvenient, vulnerable, or emotionally unstable, institutions discard them quickly to protect profit and reputation. Victor Fries eventually became inconvenient. His obsession with Nora conflicted with GothCorp's broader financial interests. He pushed ethical limits recklessly. He prioritized saving one life over corporate timelines and legal safety concerns. To Boyle and others like him, Victor stopped resembling a respected scientist and began looking like a liability. That transformation enraged Victor emotionally because he still viewed the work through love while GothCorp viewed it through ownership. Everything surrounding Nora's preservation became a battlefield between human desperation and corporate greed. And Gotham always seems to side with greed eventually. The city's institutions repeatedly fail vulnerable people throughout Batman's world because systems built around wealth and influence protect themselves first. Hospitals become businesses. Research becomes competition. Political influence shapes ethical decisions quietly behind closed doors. Victor Fries entered that world already emotionally fragile. From fear and grief, GothCorp pushed him further toward collapse. Ferris Boyle especially represents the emotional coldness poisoning Gotham's upper class. Unlike villains driven by theatrical madness or visible violence, Boyle destroys lives through indifference. He does not need to laugh while people suffer because their suffering barely registers emotionally to him at all. That indifference may be even more frightening than cruelty sometimes, because cruelty at least acknowledges human pain exists. Indifference ignores it completely. Victor gradually realized Nora's life mattered less to GothCorp than maintaining control over the research itself. Funding became conditional. Corporate pressure intensified. Decisions increasingly revolved around financial risk rather than moral responsibility. The very institutions Victor trusted to help preserve life instead began threatening the one thing he cared about most. And all the while, Nora remained trapped between life and death, while powerful men debated profits. That emotional horror consumed Victor completely. For someone already struggling emotionally with helplessness and fear, Gothcorp's betrayal felt catastrophic because it confirmed his worst suspicions about humanity and institutions. The world did not care about saving Nora the way he did. Executives valued money over suffering. Corporate systems treated fragile human lives like negotiable business complications. Science itself began feeling corrupted, not because Victor stopped believing in scientific progress, but because powerful institutions twisted science toward greed instead of compassion. Research became another tool of exploitation inside Gotham, controlled by wealthy figures disconnected from ordinary emotional pain. Victor responded to this realization badly, very badly, because people who spend years emotionally isolated often struggle processing betrayal in healthy ways once trust finally breaks. Victor already lacked strong emotional support systems outside Nora. Gothcorp's manipulation deepened his paranoia, anger, and obsession until compromise became impossible. He stopped seeing executives as employers. He saw them as obstacles standing between Nora and survival. And once someone trapped inside, desperation begins viewing human beings as obstacles rather than people. Morality starts collapsing rapidly. This was the emotional point where Victor Fries truly began losing himself. Not fully yet, not completely, but the foundations were already cracking. Love transformed into desperation. Desperation transformed into obsession. And corporate betrayal transformed Victor's remaining trust in institutions into bitterness and rage. Ferris Boyle became symbolic of everything Victor now hated about Gotham. Powerful people protecting profits while ordinary lives slipped away unnoticed beneath them. Boyle's decisions were not emotional. They were practical, efficient, calculated. And that made them feel monstrous to Victor Fries. Because while Boyle returned home to warm offices and expensive comfort, Nora remained dying. While executives debated contracts and ownership rights, Victor watched the woman he loved grow weaker. That emotional imbalance became unbearable. And somewhere inside cold laboratories filled with cryogenic machinery humming softly beneath artificial lights, Victor Fries crossed a line psychologically he would never fully return from afterward. He stopped believing Gotham's institutions could save anyone honestly. He stopped trusting the systems surrounding science and medicine. Most importantly, he stopped believing morality mattered more than keeping Nora alive. And in a city like Gotham, once grief and obsession become stronger than ethics, tragedy rarely stays far behind for long. The accident that created Mr. Freeze. By the time everything finally collapsed around Victor Fries, the man who would later become Mr. Freeze was already emotionally exhausted beyond what most people could survive calmly, because fear, sleeplessness, obsession, and desperation had slowly consumed nearly every part of his life, while he fought endlessly to keep Nora Fries alive against an illness refusing to stop. The laboratories inside Gothcorp no longer felt like places of scientific discovery anymore. They felt like battlegrounds, where time itself hunted Victor through glowing monitors, cryogenic chambers, medical reports, and endless calculations, searching for a miracle that always seemed just beyond reach. And somewhere inside all that pressure, tragedy finally arrived. Different versions of Victor's origin describe the accident with slight variations, yet the emotional truth remains horrifyingly similar every time. There is always conflict. There is always desperation. And there is always a moment where science, greed, fear, and grief collide violently enough to destroy the last ordinary parts of Victor Fries forever. The night itself likely felt cold long before the chemicals ever touched him. Gothcorp's laboratories were filled with metallic surfaces, refrigerated systems, humming machinery, and sterile, artificial light reflecting against glass chambers where Victor continued working obsessively, even while the world around him increasingly treated him like a dangerous problem rather than a grieving scientist. Nora remained preserved through experimental cryogenic methods, while Victor pushed his research further and further into territory most institutions feared. To him, stopping was impossible. Stopping meant losing her. That emotional reality drove every decision he made during those final days before the accident. Victor no longer trusted GothCorp executives. He no longer believed men like Ferris Boyle cared whether Nora survived at all. The company wanted control over the research. Victor wanted time, and time was disappearing quickly. The confrontation between Victor and GothCorp became inevitable because desperation and corporate greed cannot coexist peacefully forever. Boyle viewed Victor as unstable and increasingly dangerous. Victor viewed Boyle as someone willing to destroy Nora's only hope for financial convenience and institutional protection. Both men believed they were fighting for control. Only one of them understood that a human life stood at the center of the conflict. That imbalance matters deeply, because while GothCorp treated the situation like a corporate crisis requiring containment, Victor experienced it emotionally, like the possible murder of the only person he truly loved. Panic already distorted his judgment by this point. Fear had consumed too much of him. The emotional pressure surrounding Nora's condition had become unbearable. And then the accident happened. Whether through sabotage, physical struggle, equipment failure, or Boyle's attempt to shut down Victor's work permanently, the laboratory transformed from controlled scientific environment into chaos within seconds. Cryogenic chemicals exploded outward. Cooling systems ruptured violently. Freezing compounds flooded the room while alarms screamed through the facility beneath flashing emergency lights. Victor Fries was caught directly inside it. The physical horror of that moment is difficult to fully imagine. Most industrial accidents injure the body through heat, fire, or impact. Victor's destruction came through cold, so extreme it rewrote the biological rules keeping him alive. Cryogenic chemicals saturated his body, while experimental compounds and refrigeration systems altered him at cellular level. Temperatures no ordinary human could survive flooded through his bloodstream and nervous system instantly. And somehow, impossibly, Victor lived. But survival came at a terrible cost. When Victor finally regained consciousness afterward, the world had become unrecognizable to him physically. His body no longer reacted to temperature the way ordinary human bodies do. Warm environments caused unbearable pain and biological instability. His altered physiology now required extreme cold simply to remain alive. The scientist who once studied cryogenic preservation had become trapped inside it himself. That transformation carried enormous symbolic tragedy, because Victor Fries did not simply suffer injury during the accident. He lost ordinary human existence permanently. The things most people never think about again became impossible for him afterward. Warm sunlight against skin, normal human touch, breathing ordinary air safely, living without mechanical support. Even simple closeness with another person became dangerous now. The world itself had turned hostile to his body. And perhaps, most devastating of all, warmth itself became something he could no longer survive beside. That detail matters emotionally because warmth symbolized nearly everything Victor once loved. Nora brought emotional warmth into his isolated life years earlier. Their relationship softened the cold loneliness shaping his personality. Now, after the accident, Victor became physically separated from warmth forever. It was as though the universe transformed his emotional tragedy into biological reality. The horror surrounding his condition extended beyond physical pain too. Victor's altered body required refrigerated environments constantly, forcing him into specialized cryogenic armor simply to remain functional. The suit that later became iconic throughout Gotham was not originally designed as a weapon or symbol of fear. It was life support. Without it, Victor Fries would die. Imagine the psychological terror connected to that realization. One moment, Victor was a scientist desperately trying to preserve the woman he loved. The next, he became something medically unnatural himself, trapped inside freezing machinery because ordinary existence had become impossible permanently. And all the while, Nora remained suspended between life and death nearby. That emotional detail makes everything even more tragic. Victor had sacrificed nearly everything trying to save Nora, and now he could no longer even exist beside her normally anymore. Any future they once imagined together vanished instantly inside that laboratory accident. Even if Nora survived someday, Victor could never return to ordinary life again. The man she loved had effectively died there. This is why the birth of Mr. Freeze feels less like the creation of a villain and more like a symbolic death. Victor Freeze did survive physically, but enormous parts of his humanity shattered during that accident. The freezing chemicals altered more than his body. They affected his emotional state too, though exactly how varies depending on the version of the story being told. Some interpretations suggest the accident reduced his ability to feel emotions naturally, muting emotional warmth alongside physical warmth. Others portray Victor as psychologically traumatized rather than chemically emotionless. Either way, the result remains hauntingly similar. Victor became colder emotionally after the accident, not because he stopped loving Nora. In fact, his love for her may have become even more obsessive afterward. But his connection to ordinary human feeling weakened beneath trauma, isolation, and biological transformation. Pain changes people. Extreme suffering reshapes emotional responses. Victor now existed separated from humanity, physically and psychologically at the same time, and Gotham responded to him exactly as Gotham often responds to damaged people, with fear, not compassion, not understanding, fear. The moment Victor emerged from the accident, institutions no longer viewed him as a scientist or grieving husband anymore. He became a dangerous anomaly, unstable and frightening. The corporate systems that once exploited his brilliance now treated him like a problem requiring containment. This betrayal deepened the psychological damage enormously. Victor likely felt abandoned completely at this stage. Gothcorp failed Nora. The accident destroyed his body. Society recoiled from him in horror. Every remaining connection to ordinary human life collapsed almost simultaneously. All that remained was the mission: save Nora. That objective became the final thread holding Victor's fractured identity together. And so the man known as Mr. Freeze truly emerged from the ruins of Victor Freeze's former life. Not born from cruelty or hunger for domination, but from unbearable grief fused with physical transformation and emotional isolation beyond ordinary comprehension. His new appearance reflected that tragedy perfectly. Pale skin, frozen breath, mechanical armor glowing cold blue beneath Gotham's darkness. A voice carrying exhaustion more than rage. Mr. Freeze looked less like a conqueror and more like a ghost preserved inside ice after the world he loved disappeared forever. Even his crimes afterward would carry this sadness beneath them. Unlike Gotham's more theatrical villains, Freeze rarely seemed energized by violence itself. There was no joy in what he became, no excitement, no emotional satisfaction, only purpose stripped down to survival and obsession. The accident froze Victor Freeze emotionally in many ways. Not literally without feeling, but trapped permanently inside the moment he lost everything. Trauma often works this way psychologically. People become unable to move forward emotionally because part of them remains stuck inside the worst moment of their lives forever. Victor never escaped that laboratory. Not truly. Every freezing weapon he later built reflected the accident. Every refrigerated chamber echoed the world that destroyed him. Every icy crime scene carried fragments of the horror that reshaped his existence permanently. And somewhere beneath the armor and frozen breath remained the memory of a quiet scientist who once believed intelligence and love together might save the future. Now he stood transformed into something Gotham could only describe through fear and coldness. Mr. Freeze, not merely a villain, but the living result of grief, corporate betrayal, scientific obsession, and human desperation colliding violently enough to kill one life and create another in its place. A frozen figure wandering Gotham's endless night, searching hopelessly for warmth in a world his own body could never touch again, living in a frozen body. After the accident inside GothCorp transformed Victor Fries forever, survival itself became something unnatural and painful, because the man who once studied cryogenic preservation from behind laboratory glass now existed trapped inside its consequences every moment of his life. The scientific theories he once explored intellectually had become biological reality inside his own body, and there was no cure waiting for him, no comforting promise that ordinary life might eventually return after recovery. There would be no recovery. The cold was permanent now. At first, Victor likely refused accepting the full horror of his condition emotionally, because trauma often creates disbelief before understanding settles in completely. People surviving catastrophic accidents sometimes wake expecting life to continue normally once the immediate pain fades away. Victor probably wanted to believe the cryogenic suit surrounding him represented temporary medical support while scientists searched for answers. But each passing day forced him closer toward the terrifying truth. His body no longer belonged to the normal world. Ordinary temperatures caused agony. Warm environments destabilized his altered physiology dangerously. Even stepping outside, controlled refrigeration systems threatened death. The human body naturally seeks warmth for comfort and survival. Yet Victor Fries had become something biologically reversed, a man whose continued existence depended entirely on freezing conditions. That realization carried psychological horror beyond physical suffering alone, because people do not fully appreciate how much ordinary human life depends on touch, warmth, closeness, and physical comfort until those things disappear completely. Most individuals move through life without noticing sunlight against skin, the warmth of another person's hand, or the comfort of breathing ordinary air inside familiar spaces. Victor lost access to all of it almost instantly. And worse still, he lost it while already emotionally devastated by fear surrounding Nora Fries. That emotional combination nearly destroyed him. If Victor had suffered the accident before meeting Nora, perhaps isolation would have felt easier to endure psychologically, because loneliness already shaped much of his earlier life. But now, he understood emotional connection deeply enough to feel exactly what he lost. He remembered warmth. He remembered companionship. He remembered quiet evenings beside Nora before hospitals, laboratories, and cryogenic chambers consumed everything. Now, even standing physically close to another human being became dangerous and unnatural. The cryogenic suit keeping him alive reflected this tragedy perfectly. To outsiders, the armor later associated with Mr. Freeze appears intimidating and mechanical, a cold shell glowing beneath Gotham's darkness like something inhuman wandering through storms and frozen streets. But originally, the suit was not designed to inspire fear. It was a prison built for survival. Victor needed it constantly because without controlled refrigeration systems circulating through the armor, his altered body would fail rapidly. Tubes, cooling mechanisms, temperature regulators, and reinforced materials surrounded him every moment. He could no longer simply wake up and exist naturally within the world. He had to maintain himself like fragile machinery. That experience slowly changed how Victor viewed himself psychologically. At first, he likely still thought of the suit as equipment, helping him survive temporarily. But over time, the separation between Victor Fries and Mr. Freeze became harder to distinguish emotionally because the armor transformed into his permanent existence rather than protective technology alone. He stopped dressing in the suit. He lived inside it. And living inside machinery changes a person's relationship with humanity slowly over time. Everyday experiences most people rely on for emotional stability vanished from Victor's life one by one. Restaurants, crowded streets, ordinary apartments, human touch, casual interaction, spontaneous moments of warmth and closeness. Even weather itself became hostile. Sunlight represented danger, heated rooms became threats, The entire physical world turned incompatible with his survival. That level of isolation would break many people emotionally. Victor endured it partly because obsession surrounding Nora still gave him purpose. Without her preserved existence waiting inside cryogenic suspension, he may have surrendered completely to despair much earlier. Nora remained the final emotional connection, tying him to the person he once was, before the accident destroyed his ordinary life. But even that connection became distorted by coldness over time, because when someone lives separated from humanity long enough, emotional distance begins hardening into habit. Victor's isolation was not only social, it was physical, biological, and psychological simultaneously. Every interaction with ordinary people reinforced his difference from them. Fear followed him. People stared. Institutions treated him like a dangerous anomaly rather than a wounded man. And Gotham's response only deepened the divide further. Gotham City has always struggled showing compassion toward damaged individuals, especially those who no longer fit society's expectations of normal human life. Gotham tolerates suffering as long as it remains hidden quietly behind closed doors. But visible tragedy unsettles the city deeply because it reminds citizens how fragile ordinary existence truly is. Victor Freeze became impossible to ignore. His appearance frightened people. His condition defied medical understanding. His dependence on freezing temperatures transformed him into something closer to urban legend than ordinary human being. Rumors spread through Gotham about the frozen scientist trapped inside refrigerated armor. Fear replaced sympathy quickly, and fear isolated Victor even further. At some point, he likely stopped trying to reconnect with normal society altogether because the effort became too painful emotionally. Human interaction now required barriers, distance, caution, and constant awareness of his condition. The world could no longer touch him naturally, and he could no longer touch it in return. This physical separation slowly evolved into emotional separation too. That transformation matters enormously, because coldness in Mr. Freeze's story always functions symbolically as much as physically. The freezing temperatures surrounding Victor reflect the emotional numbness gradually overtaking his life. As warmth disappeared physically, emotional warmth began fading alongside it. Not entirely, Victor still loved Nora deeply, but his ability to connect with anyone else weakened dramatically. Pain often creates emotional narrowing this way. People suffering extreme trauma sometimes focus entirely on one remaining emotional anchor, while the rest of humanity begins feeling distant and abstract. Victor's world shrank smaller and smaller until almost nothing mattered outside preserving Nora and surviving his condition. Ordinary human concerns started feeling irrelevant. Morality blurred. Compassion weakened. Empathy narrowed toward Nora alone, while the rest of the world increasingly resembled obstacles, strangers, or threats rather than people. This did not happen all at once. That is important. Victor Freeze did not wake up after the accident, suddenly transformed into a heartless villain. The process happened gradually through endless isolation, physical suffering, and emotional exhaustion. Every day inside the cryogenic suit reminded him he no longer belonged among ordinary people. Every failed attempt at normal interaction reinforced alienation. Every frightened reaction from others deepened his withdrawal. Eventually, separating emotionally from humanity became easier than enduring constant rejection and pain. And perhaps most tragic of all, Victor began embracing coldness symbolically because it felt honest to his condition. Warmth represented a world he lost forever. Coldness represented survival, control, preservation, stillness. Ice did not betray him the way corporations, institutions, and ordinary human systems already had. Ice preserved, ice protected, ice stopped decay. These beliefs grew stronger inside Victor's mind over time, until freezing itself became emotionally comforting rather than horrifying. He surrounded himself with refrigerated laboratories, frozen chambers, and snow-covered environments because they reflected his transformed existence perfectly. there is something deeply sad about this evolution. The man who once found emotional peace beside another human being slowly replaced that warmth with machinery, silence, and ice, because human life itself had become too painful and inaccessible to endure anymore. Even his speech changed in many portrayals. Victor often speaks slowly, calmly, almost mechanically after becoming Mr. Freeze. Some interpretations suggest the chemicals affected emotional expression biologically. Others portray this coldness as psychological adaptation developed through years of suffering and isolation. Either way, the result feels haunting. Mr. Freeze often sounds like someone emotionally distant from ordinary human life, not because he lacks intelligence or memory, but because grief and isolation froze parts of his emotional responsiveness alongside his physical condition. Batman notices this during their encounters. Batman recognizes tragedy inside Victor Freeze because Bruce Wayne understands isolation, trauma, and emotional obsession deeply himself. But even Batman sees how far Victor has drifted away from ordinary humanity by this point. Freeze no longer experiences the world through warmth, connection, or community. He experiences it through preservation, survival, and emotional distance. The tragedy is that part of Victor likely understands what he is becoming. Somewhere beneath the armor and frozen breath remains the memory of the quieter man Nora once loved. That memory probably hurts enormously because Victor can compare what he once felt emotionally against the cold existence surrounding him now. And still, he keeps moving deeper into it because returning feels impossible. The world no longer has space for Victor Freeze as an ordinary man. Society fears Mr. Freeze too much. His body cannot survive normal life. His obsession with preserving Nora consumes everything else. Step by step, he begins identifying less with humanity and more with coldness itself, not because he hates people naturally, but because separation eventually changes identity. And so the frozen figure wandering Gotham's endless nights continues slipping further away from the warm human life he once briefly held beside Nora, until even his own reflection, beneath the glowing blue lights of his cryogenic helmet, begins resembling less a man trapped inside ice and more a ghost preserved within it forever. Gotham's criminal underworld and survival. After the accident transformed Victor Freeze into the frozen figure Gotham would eventually fear as Mr. Freeze, survival became painfully expensive because remaining alive no longer required ordinary food, shelter, and medical care alone. Victor needed specialized refrigeration systems, cryogenic technology, custom-built armor, laboratory equipment, rare chemicals, power sources, and constant maintenance, simply to continue existing from one day to the next. And beyond all of that remained the greatest expense of all, preserving Nora Freeze in suspended cryogenic sleep while he searched endlessly for a cure capable of saving her life. That kind of survival could not be maintained quietly forever, especially not in Gotham City. Gotham is a city where desperation often pushes wounded people toward dangerous choices because legal systems rarely protect the vulnerable properly. Honest people lose homes while corrupt executives build towers. Scientific research disappears beneath corporate ownership. Medical treatment becomes available only to those wealthy enough to purchase time. People already suffering emotionally eventually reach moments where morality begins competing directly against survival itself. Victor Freeze reached that moment long ago. At first, he likely tried avoiding crime completely. Even after GothCorp's betrayal and the horrifying transformation of his body, part of Victor probably still viewed himself as a scientist rather than a criminal. He needed equipment, he needed funding, he needed access to restricted technology. But perhaps, in the beginning, he still searched for legitimate paths forward, hoping research institutions, underground medical contacts, or sympathetic organizations might help him continue Nora's preservation without forcing him deeper into Gotham's darkness. But Gotham rarely rewards hope for long. Doors closed around him one after another. Companies feared him. Scientists rejected him. Institutions treated him as unstable, dangerous, or medically impossible. No one wanted responsibility for the frozen man requiring sub-zero environments simply to survive. And even fewer people cared enough about Nora's condition to risk resources helping someone society already viewed as a monster. That emotional abandonment pushed Victor toward Gotham's criminal underworld slowly, not because he admired criminals, not because he enjoyed violence, but because the underworld was often the only part of Gotham willing to trade with desperate people, no matter how damaged or dangerous they became. There is something deeply tragic about this transformation, because Victor Fries never entered Gotham's criminal world like ambitious gangsters or power-hungry villains often do. He did not seek territory, reputation, or dominance. He entered crime almost like a dying man entering freezing water simply because no other path remained open. Crime became survival. That distinction matters enormously when understanding Mr. Freeze emotionally. Most Gotham criminals commit violence for greed, ego, or chaos. Freeze viewed crime differently. To him, every robbery, technological theft, or illegal operation connected directly to keeping Nora preserved and maintaining the systems required for his own survival. Money itself meant almost nothing emotionally to Victor, beyond what it could purchase for the mission. And that mission justified everything inside his mind. This is where desperation becomes morally dangerous. Because once someone convinces themselves their actions serve a higher emotional purpose, ethical boundaries begin dissolving rapidly. Victor did not wake up one morning deciding he wanted to terrorize Gotham. Instead, each compromise likely felt temporary and necessary. Steal cryogenic materials, because Nora's chamber requires maintenance. Rob a laboratory, because a breakthrough treatment may exist there. Attack corporate facilities, because GothCorp deserves punishment and possesses technology Victor needs. Every crime became explainable inside his own reasoning, and step by step, morality weakened beneath desperation and grief. Gotham's underworld recognized Victor's value quickly too. A man with advanced scientific knowledge, cryogenic weapons, and nothing left to lose represented both opportunity and danger. Criminal organizations throughout Gotham often rely on fear and brutality, but Freeze brought something different into that world. Intelligence fused with emotional detachment and experimental technology capable of terrifying even hardened criminals. Yet Victor never truly belonged among them. That emotional disconnect remained obvious during many of his interactions with Gotham's criminal networks. Freeze rarely behaved like ordinary gangsters. He did not enjoy criminal culture. He did not celebrate violence. He showed little interest in status, luxury, or theatrical displays of power. In fact, many criminals found him unsettling precisely because he felt emotionally distant from their world. Gangsters often understand greed, rage, or ambition because those emotions are familiar. Victor Freeze operated through cold obsession and quiet desperation instead. He spoke calmly while discussing terrifying things. He moved through criminal operations with mechanical focus rather than excitement or cruelty. To many people inside Gotham's underworld, Mr. Freeze resembled less a traditional criminal and more a living scientific disaster wandering through the city searching for resources. This made alliances difficult. Freeze sometimes worked beside criminals temporarily when their goals aligned, but genuine trust rarely existed. Gotham's underworld values loyalty only as long as profit continues flowing, and Victor Freeze cared very little about criminal politics or organizational hierarchy. He cooperated when necessary, then disappeared back into frozen laboratories and hidden chambers beneath the city. The underworld feared him almost as much as Batman eventually did, partly because Victor's emotional instability made him unpredictable. Not chaotic like the Joker, something quieter and more dangerous. Mr. Freeze often behaved like someone whose connection to ordinary human priorities had weakened severely over time. If criminals interfered with Nora's preservation or threatened his research, Victor responded with frightening intensity because protecting Nora remained more important to him than human life, alliances, or criminal loyalty. And that truth reveals how far desperation had already changed him emotionally. Because once upon a time, Victor Fries dedicated his life to preserving fragile things compassionately. Now, he increasingly endangered innocent people while pursuing the same goal. The emotional contradiction sat at the center of his tragedy constantly. He still loved Nora genuinely, but the methods he used to save her grew darker each year. This progression happened gradually enough that Victor likely justified each step internally. Trauma often changes morality slowly, rather than all at once. Small compromises become easier after repeated desperation. Once someone crosses one ethical boundary successfully, crossing the next becomes simpler emotionally. Freeze's crimes escalated this way. At first, perhaps theft felt unavoidable, but temporary. Then, armed robbery became acceptable because time was running out. Then, using cryogenic weaponry against security forces seemed necessary for survival. Eventually, innocent people became collateral damage within operations Victor once might have found morally horrifying. And through all of this, he continued believing love motivated him. That is one of the saddest parts of Mr. Freeze's story. Victor Freeze does not see himself as greedy. From his perspective, Gotham already abandoned him and Nora completely. Corporations exploited him, institutions rejected him, society feared him. Why should he obey laws created by systems that already condemned them both? Inside Victor's mind, survival itself became rebellion against a world willing to let Nora die. And perhaps part of Gotham even reinforced this belief. The city's corruption constantly proves wealth and power matter more than ordinary human suffering. Victor watched executives profit from scientific research while people died untreated. He saw institutions protecting corporate interests instead of vulnerable lives. Gotham repeatedly demonstrated that morality often bends beneath money and influence already. So why should he sacrifice Nora for rules nobody else truly follows honestly? That question haunted the remaining humanity inside him. Batman later recognizes this conflict during encounters with Mr. Freeze. Batman sees a man whose crimes emerge from grief rather than pure malice. Bruce Wayne understands obsession, trauma, and emotional isolation deeply enough to recognize the tragedy beneath Freeze's actions. But Batman also sees how dangerous Victor has become. Because grief combined with intelligence and desperation creates terrifying consequences when left unchecked. Freeze may not enjoy violence, yet he increasingly accepts it as necessary. That emotional shift matters because indifference toward harm can become almost as dangerous as cruelty itself. Victor's frozen worldview narrowed until only Nora truly remained emotionally real to him. Everyone else drifted further away psychologically. Police officers became obstacles. Security guards became interference. Corporate employees became representatives of systems that betrayed him. Ordinary citizens often became distant figures, existing outside the emotional center of his world entirely. This is how isolation changes people over time. Without connection, empathy weakens gradually. And living inside a frozen body surrounded by cold machinery only intensified that separation further. Victor spent more time with cryogenic systems than with human beings. More time inside hidden laboratories than ordinary society. More time speaking to preserved silence than emotional warmth. The criminal underworld merely became another tool helping sustain that isolated existence. Yet despite everything, there remained moments where traces of Victor Freeze still surfaced beneath Mr. Freeze's icy exterior. Some stories show him sparing innocent people unnecessarily. Others reveal guilt flickering briefly beneath the cold detachment. And almost always, whenever Nora becomes endangered directly, emotional vulnerability returns visibly to him again. Those moments matter because they remind audiences something human still survives inside all the ice. Broken, distorted, buried beneath obsession and grief, but still there. And perhaps that lingering humanity makes Mr. Freeze more tragic than many Gotham villains because he never fully stops being Victor Fries emotionally. He simply drifts further away from ordinary morality each year while convincing himself survival leaves no other choice anymore, until eventually Gotham no longer sees the grieving scientist at all. Only the frozen criminal moving silently through snow-covered streets beneath glowing blue lights, stealing whatever he needs to keep the woman he loves, suspended between life and death for one more night, against the endless cold closing around them both. Batman and Mr. Freeze, enemies who understand each other. When Batman first encountered Mr. Freeze within the frozen shadows of Gotham City, the conflict may have appeared simple to outsiders at first glance. Another dangerous criminal, using advanced technology to terrorize the city, while Batman attempted to stop him before innocent people were harmed. Gotham had seen many strange villains already, figures dressed in theatrical costumes who transformed personal trauma into chaos and violence. From a distance, Mr. Freeze seemed like just another example of Gotham creating monsters from suffering. But Batman understood almost immediately that Victor Freeze was different, not harmless, not innocent, but different. Because beneath the refrigerated armor, cryogenic weaponry, and cold detachment, Bruce Wayne recognized something painfully familiar inside Victor Freeze, namely the emotional shape of a man destroyed by grief and rebuilt around obsession afterward. That recognition changed everything between them. Batman rarely feels sympathy for criminals driven by cruelty or selfishness. Gotham is filled with people who enjoy power, violence, corruption, and fear, but Mr. Freeze never resembled those enemies emotionally. Even during violent confrontations, Victor carried sadness rather than hatred. His crimes often felt driven by necessity and desperation instead of greed or emotional pleasure. Bruce Wayne understood desperation intimately. After all, Batman himself was created through grief. Long before Gotham feared the Dark Knight moving through rooftops after midnight, Bruce Wayne was only a child kneeling beside the bodies of his murdered parents in Crime Alley, emotionally shattered by a moment that transformed the rest of his life forever. Like Victor Freeze, Bruce lost the person who gave his world warmth and emotional safety. Like Victor, he responded by dedicating himself obsessively toward fighting against helplessness through extreme discipline and purpose. The similarities between them become unsettling once viewed carefully. Both men were shaped permanently by traumatic loss. Both buried themselves inside specialized environments separated from ordinary humanity. Both transformed pain into identity, and both sacrificed normal human life completely in pursuit of impossible emotional goals. Batman and Mr. Freeze exist like distorted reflections of one another inside Gotham's darkness. The difference lies mainly in direction. Bruce Wayne transformed grief into a mission to protect others from suffering similar pain. Victor Freeze transformed grief into obsession, centered entirely around preserving one person at any cost. Yet emotionally, the foundations remain strikingly alike. That is why Batman often approaches Freeze differently than many other villains. During their encounters, Bruce rarely speaks to Victor with hatred or disgust. Instead, there is usually exhaustion, sadness, and even pity beneath Batman's voice, because Bruce understands how easily he himself might have become something similar under different circumstances. This possibility haunts Batman deeply, because when Bruce Wayne looks at Victor Freeze, he sees more than a criminal trapped inside ice. He sees a warning about what grief can become when isolation and obsession consume someone completely. And perhaps Victor sees something equally unsettling in Batman. After all, Mr. Freeze also recognizes pieces of himself inside Bruce Wayne's hidden pain. Even before learning Batman's full identity in some versions of the story, Freeze understands obsession. He understands living outside ordinary humanity. He understands sacrificing relationships, comfort, and emotional stability for a singular mission consuming every part of life. Both men stopped belonging to normal society long ago. Batman hides inside shadows and caves beneath Gotham, while Mr. Freeze survives inside refrigerated chambers and frozen laboratories. Neither man experiences ordinary human existence anymore. Both built armored identities around emotional wounds, too painful to confront directly. Even their environments reflect similar psychological states. Batman surrounds himself with darkness. Freeze surrounds himself with coldness. Both spaces function like emotional armor protecting damaged minds from unbearable grief beneath the surface. This emotional connection creates strange tension during their battles because Batman often fights Freeze less like an enemy he hates and more like someone he desperately wishes he could still save before it becomes too late. Bruce understands that Victor Freeze was not born monstrous. Gotham, tragedy, corporate betrayal, and obsession slowly transformed him over time. That understanding makes every confrontation feel heavier emotionally, especially because Batman knows Freeze's crimes still endanger innocent people, regardless of tragic motivation. Bruce cannot allow Victor to freeze civilians, rob laboratories, or attack the city simply because grief explains his behavior. Sympathy does not erase responsibility, and this creates painful, emotional conflict between them. Batman wants to stop Mr. Freeze, while simultaneously mourning what happened to Victor Freeze. Freeze, meanwhile, often views Batman with complicated resentment because Bruce represents something Victor can no longer fully become. Despite Batman's trauma and isolation, Bruce still fights for Gotham broadly. He still protects strangers. He still maintains some connection to humanity beyond his own suffering. Victor lost much of that connection years ago. His world narrowed until Nora became almost the only emotionally real thing remaining inside it. Everything else faded behind obsession and survival. Batman sees this emotional narrowing clearly, and perhaps that is why he often tries reasoning with Freeze rather than simply defeating him physically, because Bruce understands obsession too well. Batman himself walks dangerously close to emotional collapse constantly. His mission consumes his life. His trauma shapes every decision. His fear of loss isolates him from ordinary happiness repeatedly. The difference is that Bruce continues fighting against becoming emotionally numb, while Victor gradually surrendered to it. This distinction matters enormously. Bruce Wayne believes suffering should create compassion. Victor Freeze increasingly believes suffering justifies sacrifice. That ideological divide turns their battles into tragic emotional conflicts rather than simple fights between hero and villain. Every confrontation carries the sense that two broken men are testing different responses to grief itself. Can pain make someone stronger without destroying their humanity? Batman believes yes. Mr. Freeze increasingly believes no. And Gotham watches both answers unfold simultaneously through them. Their encounters also reveal another important similarity, namely how both men attempt to preserve the past emotionally rather than fully living in the present. Bruce Wayne remains psychologically connected to Crime Alley every night he becomes Batman. Victor Freeze remains emotionally frozen beside Nora's illness and the laboratory accident destroying his former life. Neither truly moved forward. They survived. But survival is not the same as healing. This is why Batman often responds to Freeze with pity rather than rage, even after violent crimes occur. Bruce recognizes the loneliness surrounding Victor because he experiences loneliness himself constantly. He understands what it means to wake each day already consumed by mission and grief before the world even begins moving around you. There are moments throughout Batman's stories where this understanding becomes almost heartbreaking. Sometimes, Batman risks enormous danger trying to help Nora or find treatment rather than simply imprisoning Freeze permanently. Sometimes he speaks to Victor gently, despite everything that happened. Sometimes he even acknowledges openly that Victor Freeze still possesses humanity beneath the ice. Those moments matter because Gotham rarely offers compassion to damaged people. Batman does, perhaps because he knows how desperately he himself sometimes needs it too. At the same time, Freeze's condition also terrifies Bruce Wayne emotionally because Victor represents what obsession looks like when it fully replaces ordinary human connection. Batman constantly fears crossing that line himself. He fears becoming consumed entirely by darkness, mission, paranoia, and emotional isolation until Bruce Wayne disappears beneath Batman forever. Mr. Freeze already lost that battle. Victor Fries exists now almost entirely through obsession surrounding Nora's preservation. The frozen armor, criminal activity, and emotional detachment all reflect a man whose original identity has become buried beneath grief and survival instincts. Bruce sees that tragedy clearly, and perhaps part of him fears he is looking into his own possible future. This emotional complexity makes their battles strangely quiet compared to Batman's conflicts with more theatrical villains. Freeze rarely taunts Batman endlessly like the Joker. Their confrontations often feel colder emotionally, filled with exhaustion, restrained anger, and underlying sadness rather than chaos. Two wounded men standing on opposite sides of moral collapse, both shaped by trauma, both isolated from ordinary life, both transformed into symbols by Gotham's darkness, and both still searching for something they lost long ago. Even visually, their confrontations carry symbolic meaning. Batman moves through darkness like living shadow, while Mr. Freeze advances surrounded by frost and artificial cold. Night and winter colliding against Gotham's skyline, fear facing grief, isolation confronting isolation. Yet despite all their similarities, Batman continues resisting the final, emotional surrender that consumed Victor Freeze. Bruce still believes people matter beyond personal pain. Freeze increasingly believes only Nora matters anymore. That belief pushes Victor toward increasingly dangerous actions, because once someone stops emotionally valuing broader humanity, morality collapses quickly afterward. Batman fights against this collapse every time they meet, not only physically, emotionally. He fights to remind Victor Freeze that humanity still exists beneath the frozen armor somewhere. Sometimes that humanity briefly surfaces. Freeze occasionally shows mercy unexpectedly. He sometimes hesitates, harming innocents unnecessarily. Certain versions of the character even cooperate temporarily with Batman when Nora's safety or greater threats become involved. These moments reveal something tragic and important. Victor Freeze is not fully gone, but he is disappearing slowly, and Batman knows it. That knowledge creates sorrow beneath every battle, because Bruce Wayne understands better than most people how difficult it becomes to return from years of obsession, trauma, and emotional isolation. He sees a man trapped inside grief so completely that coldness became both prison and identity simultaneously. Still, Batman continues trying, because perhaps deep down, Bruce hopes saving Victor Fries might also prove something about himself. Namely that broken people, shaped by loss and obsession, do not always have to lose their humanity forever. And so, beneath Gotham's falling snow and endless rain, the Dark Knight and the frozen scientist continue colliding again and again across rooftops, laboratories, and silent streets, not merely as hero and villain, but as two shattered souls reflecting different answers to the same terrible question. What happens after grief becomes the center of a person's entire life, the obsession that consumed Victor Fries. At the beginning of his tragedy, Victor Freeze loved Nora Freeze in a way that felt quiet, gentle, and deeply human. Because before the laboratories filled with ice, before the armored suit, before the crimes and frozen streets of Gotham City, Nora represented peace inside a life that had long been shaped by emotional isolation. She brought warmth into Victor's carefully controlled world and helped him feel connected to another person in ways he never fully believed possible before meeting her. But grief changes love slowly when fear becomes stronger than acceptance. And Victor Fries became more afraid of losing Nora than almost anything else in existence. That fear transformed everything. At first, his devotion still appeared understandable. A husband searching desperately for a cure to save his dying wife does not immediately resemble a monster. Most people can understand the terror connected to watching someone they love suffer while feeling powerless to stop it. Victor's refusal to surrender felt admirable in the beginning, because it came from compassion and loyalty rather than selfishness. But obsession rarely announces itself clearly when it first begins. Instead, it grows quietly beneath desperation. Victor stopped resting because every hour mattered. He stopped caring about ordinary life because Nora's survival mattered more. He stopped thinking about the future beyond saving her because imagining life without Nora became emotionally unbearable. And slowly, without fully realizing it, Victor Fries built his entire identity around one impossible mission: keep Nora alive at any cost. That final part became the danger, because once someone attaches the words "at any cost" to love, morality begins collapsing beneath emotional pressure. Every ethical line starts looking temporary. Every dangerous decision becomes easier to justify. Fear convinces people they are fighting for something noble, while they slowly lose themselves in the process. Victor believed love guided him still, and in many ways, it did. But by this stage of his life, love no longer existed alone inside him. Panic surrounded it, obsession controlled it, grief poisoned it constantly. The emotional warmth Nora once brought into Victor's life had become buried beneath desperation so intense that he could no longer imagine stopping, even when his actions endangered innocent people. That transformation happened gradually. This is important. Victor Fries did not suddenly stop caring about human life overnight. The change unfolded through years of isolation, failed hope, emotional exhaustion, and endless suffering, until preserving Nora eventually outweighed every other moral concern in his mind. There were moments where innocent people became trapped inside his crimes, simply because they stood between Victor and what he needed. Laboratories were frozen, security guards were attacked. Civilians sometimes became hostages during robberies involving cryogenic materials or experimental technology. Entire buildings risked destruction, while Freeze pursued resources connected to Nora's preservation. And every time, Victor likely justified it internally through the same emotional reasoning. If Nora dies, nothing else matters. That belief became terrifying because it reduced the rest of humanity emotionally. Other people slowly stopped feeling fully real to Victor compared to Nora's suffering. Gotham's citizens became distant figures moving through the background of his frozen existence, while Nora remained the emotional center of everything. This narrowing of empathy often happens during obsession. A person becomes so consumed by one emotional focus that broader morality fades into abstraction. Victor still understood intellectually that innocent lives mattered, but emotionally, their importance weakened compared to the overwhelming terror of losing Nora forever. That imbalance shaped every decision afterward. And the tragedy is that Victor probably recognized pieces of this transformation happening inside himself at times. Somewhere beneath the cold armor and emotional distance, fragments of the original Victor Fries still existed. He likely remembered who he once was, before obsession consumed him completely. But grief traps people strangely, especially unresolved grief, because Nora's condition placed Victor in permanent emotional suspension. She was neither fully alive beside him, nor fully gone from the world. She existed trapped between life and death inside cryogenic preservation, and Victor trapped himself emotionally in that same frozen state alongside her. He could not move forward, he could not let go, he could only continue. And continuing required increasingly dangerous sacrifices. This is where the emotional line between devotion and self-destruction becomes blurred almost beyond recognition. Love naturally asks people to sacrifice for one another sometimes. Parents sacrifice for children. Partners sacrifice for loved ones. Heroes sacrifice for innocent lives. But healthy sacrifice still recognizes limits eventually. Victor Fries lost those limits completely. Saving Nora stopped being part of his life. It became his entire existence. Everything else disappeared behind it. Relationships vanished. Human connection faded. Morality weakened. Even his own humanity slowly dissolved beneath the endless mission. And perhaps the most tragic part is that Nora herself may never have wanted him to become this. Many versions of their story suggest Nora loved Victor for his quiet humanity, intelligence, and emotional vulnerability beneath his isolation. The gentle man she cared about slowly transformed into something colder and more frightening each year while trying desperately to preserve her life. That contradiction makes his obsession heartbreaking. Victor believes every terrible thing he does proves the depth of his love, yet the deeper his obsession grows, the further he drifts away from the man Nora originally loved. Batman notices this during their encounters. Batman understands obsession intimately because Bruce Wayne also built his life around trauma and mission after losing his parents. But Batman fights constantly to prevent grief from consuming his humanity completely. Victor Fries gradually surrendered to that consumption. Bruce sees a man trapped inside emotional paralysis. Mr. Freeze no longer truly lives in the present. He exists inside endless repetition, preserving Nora, searching for cures, committing crimes for resources, retreating back into frozen isolation, and repeating the cycle again and again without emotional resolution. That is not healing, it is imprisonment, and the prison exists inside Victor's own grief as much as inside his refrigerated environments. The symbolism surrounding Freeze becomes especially painful here because coldness no longer represents survival alone. It represents emotional stagnation. Ice preserves things exactly as they are. It prevents decay temporarily, but it also prevents growth, change, and movement forward. Victor preserved Nora physically, but in doing so, he froze himself emotionally beside her forever. He stopped allowing life to continue naturally, stopped allowing grief to process, stopped allowing himself to imagine identity beyond loss and desperation. Everything inside him became frozen around the worst moment of his life. That emotional stillness slowly destroyed him. Because human beings are not meant to live entirely inside grief forever, pain must eventually move somewhere. It must transform, heal, soften, or release. Victor refused every one of those possibilities because letting go felt emotionally identical to abandoning Nora herself. So instead, he remained trapped, year after year, inside laboratories humming with cold machinery, inside armor separating him from ordinary warmth, inside endless criminal acts justified through desperate love, inside memories of Nora before illness consumed everything. And all the while, Gotham's darkness continued feeding the tragedy around him. The city never truly offered redemption or peace to people like Victor Freeze. Instead, Gotham amplified obsession, isolation, and suffering until damaged individuals became symbols of their own pain. Mr. Freeze became exactly that, a living symbol of grief refusing to die. His crimes increasingly reflected this emotional collapse too. At times, Victor became willing to freeze entire environments regardless of danger to civilians, if it meant protecting Nora's preservation systems or obtaining crucial research. In certain storylines, he endangered countless lives pursuing impossible scientific breakthroughs because failure emotionally felt worse than any moral consequence. This does not make him purely evil, but it does make him dangerous, because obsession removes proportion from moral thinking. When one goal becomes emotionally absolute, everything else eventually becomes expendable beside it. Victor Fries reached that point long ago, and yet despite everything, traces of sorrow remain visible inside him constantly. Unlike villains who enjoy destruction, Freeze often appears exhausted, mournful, and emotionally hollow. His obsession does not make him happy. It imprisons him deeper each year. That is what makes his story so devastating. Mr. Freeze is not a man empowered by obsession. He is consumed by it. Every frozen chamber, every cryogenic weapon, every snow-covered crime scene reflects the same emotional reality, namely that Victor Freeze cannot escape the moment he almost lost Nora and psychologically never survived afterward. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside himself, Victor understands the terrible truth he cannot admit openly, even if he succeeds someday, even if Nora fully awakens, even if science finally defeats death itself. The man she once loved may already be gone forever, buried beneath years of ice, grief, and obsession too deep to melt away again. Nora's awakening and emotional collapse. For years, Victor Fries lived with one single belief, holding together the frozen remains of his shattered life, namely that everything he had suffered, every crime he committed, every innocent person endangered, every night spent inside cold laboratories beneath Gotham City, and every part of his humanity sacrificed to obsession would someday become worth it if Nora Fries finally opened her eyes again and returned to him. That hope became his reason for surviving. Without it, nothing remained. And perhaps that is why the moments where Nora awakens, or learns what Victor became during the years she remained suspended between life and death, feel so emotionally devastating throughout Batman lore, because they force Victor Fries to confront a terrifying possibility he spent years refusing to face. What if saving Nora physically did not truly save their love at all? At first, the idea of Nora waking up seems like the ending Victor always dreamed about. After endless grief, endless struggle, endless crimes committed beneath the belief that love justified survival at any cost, Nora's awakening should represent victory. It should restore warmth to Victor's frozen existence and finally justify the monstrous transformation he endured trying to preserve her life. But tragedy rarely unfolds so simply in Gotham, because time changes people, even when they survive. And Victor Fries changed more than anyone. When Nora awakens in different versions of the story, one of the first emotional shocks often comes from the realization that she is not stepping back into the same world she left behind. The quiet scientist she once loved no longer exists in the form she remembers. Instead, standing before her is a man hidden inside refrigerated armor, speaking through cold mechanical systems while carrying years of violence, obsession, and emotional isolation inside him. To Victor, the years separating them may feel emotionally frozen in place. To Nora, they are gone forever. That difference creates heartbreaking emotional distance immediately. Because while Victor spent years preserving his love for Nora unchanged inside his mind, Nora awakens to discover that the man before her became something frightening and tragic during her absence. The tenderness she once brought out of him has been buried beneath endless grief and survival. The warmth defining their relationship exists now only in memory. And perhaps the cruelest part is that Victor truly believed he was protecting that warmth all along. He preserved her body, he protected her life, but in the process, he slowly destroyed the emotional world they once shared together. This becomes painfully clear in storylines where Nora learns the full truth about what Victor did for her sake. The robberies, the kidnappings, the frozen crime scenes, the innocent lives endangered while he searched for resources and scientific breakthroughs. Nora begins understanding that Victor transformed love into obsession so completely that morality itself collapsed beneath it. And that realization horrifies her, not because she stops caring about Victor, but because she sees how deeply he lost himself. There is something devastating about imagining Nora standing before the man who spent years trying to save her while realizing she barely recognizes him emotionally anymore. The soft-spoken scientist who once found peace beside her became Mr. Freeze, a figure defined by coldness, isolation, and grief so deep it reshaped his entire identity. Victor, meanwhile, often struggles understanding this emotional distance at first. From his perspective, everything he became happened because of love. Every sacrifice, every crime, every terrifying transformation originated from the refusal to abandon Nora to death. He expects her awakening to heal the suffering somehow, to finally close the emotional wound consuming him for so long. Instead, her return often exposes how badly the wound spread. Because obsession freezes people emotionally, in ways difficult to reverse. Victor spent years emotionally trapped beside the moment Nora became ill. He preserved her physically, but he also preserved his grief, fear, and desperation unchanged across time. While the world continued moving around him, Victor remained psychologically frozen beside loss. Nora, however, awakens into the present, and the present contains a version of Victor she never wanted to create. This emotional divide creates one of the deepest tragedies in Mr. Freeze's story. Love survives physically between them, but spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically, it begins collapsing beneath the weight of everything Victor became. Some versions of Nora react with sorrow, others with fear, others with guilt for what Victor sacrificed, and sometimes even anger, because how should someone respond after discovering the person who loved them devoted years to violence, obsession, and self-destruction in their name? The answer is never simple, especially because Victor's love remains genuine. That is what makes the situation so painful. Mr. Freeze is not pretending. He truly believes every terrible thing he endured proves the depth of his devotion. He sacrificed his body, his morality, his future, and his humanity, trying to preserve Nora against death itself. From his perspective, no sacrifice could ever be too great if it meant keeping her alive. But love without limits eventually stops looking like love from the outside. It begins resembling possession, obsession, and emotional imprisonment instead. And Nora often realizes this before Victor does. There are moments in certain storylines where Nora understands something Victor cannot emotionally accept, namely that survival alone is not enough to preserve a relationship. Human connection depends on growth, trust, shared emotional experience, and mutual humanity. Victor froze all of those things alongside her body years ago. He spent so long trying to stop loss that he stopped allowing life itself to continue naturally. That truth breaks him, because once Nora awakens, Victor is forced to confront the horrifying possibility that he may have lost her emotionally long before he ever succeeded in preserving her physically. The woman he loved exists beside him again, yet the emotional bridge connecting them has been damaged by years of isolation, grief, and violence. And perhaps worst of all, part of Victor understands why. Deep inside the frozen armor, remnants of the original Victor Freeze still survive. He remembers the quiet intimacy they once shared. He remembers who he used to be before obsession consumed him. Seeing Nora recoil emotionally from what he became forces him to look directly at the destruction he spent years avoiding mentally. Because Nora's awakening does not simply restore hope, it exposes the cost of his obsession fully for the first time. The emotional collapse following this realization varies across different stories, but the sadness remains consistent. Victor often reacts with confusion, denial, desperation, or renewed obsession because he cannot easily separate love from sacrifice anymore. In his mind, he destroyed himself trying to save Nora. How could she not understand that? But Nora does understand. That is the tragedy. She understands too well. She sees a man who loved her so deeply that he slowly erased himself completely in the process. She sees how fear of losing her transformed into emotional imprisonment. Neither of them can truly escape anymore. And perhaps somewhere inside herself, Nora mourns Victor too. Not only the years stolen from her life, but the loss of the man she originally fell in love with before Gotham's darkness, illness, corporate betrayal, and grief reshaped him into something colder and more distant. Batman often witnesses parts of this tragedy from outside. Batman understands better than most people how trauma can consume identity, because Bruce Wayne constantly fights against losing himself inside Batman entirely. Watching Victor and Nora struggle emotionally after reunion reinforces one of Batman's deepest fears, namely that obsession eventually destroys the very things people are trying to protect. Bruce sees that Victor's suffering never truly ended, even when Nora survives, even when she awakens, because the emotional damage extends beyond death itself now. Their love survived biologically, but fractured spiritually. This distinction matters enormously. Mr. Freeze spent years believing defeating death would solve everything emotionally. But human relationships are more fragile and complicated than physical survival alone. People change through pain. Time reshapes emotional connection. Trauma leaves scars no scientific breakthrough can fully erase. Victor preserved Nora's heartbeat, but he could not preserve the emotional life they once shared together untouched. And that realization leaves him trapped inside even deeper sorrow afterward, because now he stands before proof that obsession cannot truly reverse grief. It can only delay it, distort it, and spread it into new forms of suffering. Some versions of the story push this tragedy even further by showing Nora transformed emotionally by everything surrounding her preservation. Sometimes she becomes disconnected from Victor. Sometimes she resents him. Sometimes she struggles understanding the world she awakens into after years lost in cryogenic suspension. In every version, however, one truth remains painfully clear. The years stolen by obsession cannot simply be repaired through survival alone. Victor Fries wanted to stop loss completely. Instead, he created a different kind of loss altogether. And so, beneath Gotham's endless snowfall and pale frozen lights, Mr. Freeze often remains standing silently beside Nora once more, not as the triumphant savior he imagined becoming, but as a grieving man finally forced to understand that love cannot survive through preservation alone if the humanity holding it together disappears in the process. The monster Gotham created. There is a question hiding beneath the frozen tragedy of Mr. Freeze that makes his story far more disturbing than many of Gotham's other villains, because eventually people must ask whether Victor Freeze truly became a monster entirely through his own choices, or whether Gotham City slowly shaped him into one long before he fully understood what was happening to him. The answer is uncomfortable precisely because it is not simple. Victor Freeze absolutely made terrible decisions. He endangered innocent people. He committed violent crimes. He allowed obsession to consume his morality piece by piece until preserving Nora Freeze mattered more to him than almost anything else. Responsibility for those choices belongs partly to Victor himself. And yet, looking at Gotham honestly means recognizing something equally important. The city failed him repeatedly. Long before Victor became feared as Mr. Freeze, Gotham had already begun building the emotional conditions that would eventually destroy him. The isolation shaping his early life, the corporate greed poisoning scientific research, the cold indifference surrounding illness and suffering, the exploitation of vulnerable people by powerful institutions. All of it existed before the accident ever transformed his body physically. Victor Freeze did not emerge from nowhere. He emerged from Gotham. That distinction matters deeply, because Gotham is not simply a setting in Batman stories. Gotham behaves almost like a living force, shaping damaged people slowly over time. Fear spreads through the city like weather. Corruption infects institutions constantly. Wealth protects the powerful, while ordinary people struggle to survive emotionally beneath endless pressure. And perhaps most dangerously of all, Gotham normalizes suffering. People living there become accustomed to tragedy because the city produces so much of it continuously. Murders, corruption scandals, corporate exploitation, organized crime, mental collapse, violence, and despair surround daily life until emotional numbness begins replacing outrage. Citizens stop expecting systems to protect them honestly because failure becomes ordinary. Victor Freeze entered this environment already emotionally vulnerable. He was intelligent but isolated, sensitive but emotionally withdrawn, obsessed with preservation partly because he feared loss deeply even before Nora became ill. In a healthier city, perhaps someone like Victor might have received emotional support, meaningful human connection, ethical guidance, or institutions genuinely prioritizing human well-being above profit. But Gotham rarely nurtures fragile people carefully. Instead, it often exploits them until they break. GothCorp represents one of the clearest examples of this corruption within Victor's story. The corporation saw enormous scientific value in Victor's cryogenic research, yet viewed Victor himself largely through usefulness rather than compassion. Executives like Ferris Boyle prioritized ownership profit, and control, even while Victor's world collapsed emotionally around him. This emotional indifference accelerated his downfall dramatically. Imagine someone already terrified of losing the person they love most, while powerful institutions reduce that suffering into business calculations and financial strategy. Gotham's corporate world repeatedly taught Victor that human life mattered less than profit margins and technological control. That lesson changed him psychologically, because once someone loses faith in institutions completely, morality often becomes more personal and unstable afterward. Victor stopped believing society cared whether Nora lived or died. He stopped trusting systems designed to protect vulnerable people. Gotham convinced him survival required obsession because compassion alone would never be enough. And perhaps the worst part is that Gotham often proves this belief correct. Again and again throughout Batman lore, the city abandons wounded people until trauma transforms them into something dangerous. Harvey Dent collapses beneath corruption and psychological damage. The Riddler turns intelligence into manipulation and obsession. Poison Ivy becomes radicalized through betrayal and exploitation. Victor Freeze follows the same tragic pattern. Gotham takes suffering and feeds it until monstrosity grows from it. Not every wounded person becomes a villain, of course. Batman himself proves trauma can create someone fighting to protect others rather than destroy them. But Gotham constantly pushes damaged individuals toward emotional extremes because the city lacks the warmth, stability, and compassion needed to help people heal properly. Instead, it isolates them further. Victor's transformation reflects this perfectly. When Nora became terminally ill, Victor needed support emotionally as much as scientifically. He needed institutions genuinely dedicated to saving lives rather than controlling research. He needed people capable of helping him process fear and grief before obsession consumed him entirely. Instead, Gotham gave him corporate manipulation, emotional abandonment, and endless pressure. And once the accident altered his body permanently, the city's response became even colder. People feared him immediately. Institutions rejected him. Society viewed him as dangerous and unnatural rather than tragic. No one truly helped Victor reconnect with humanity afterward. Gotham simply watched him drift deeper into isolation until crime became the only remaining path supporting his survival and Nora's preservation. This does not erase Victor's responsibility, but it does complicate it, because Mr. Freeze became dangerous partly through choices, yet those choices formed inside a city, constantly teaching wounded people that survival matters more than morality eventually. That lesson appears everywhere throughout Gotham. The wealthy protect themselves behind towers and private security, while ordinary citizens endure violence below. Corrupt officials manipulate justice systems. Corporations exploit scientific advancement without ethical concern. Crime fills the spaces left behind by failed institutions. Emotional suffering spreads through generations because almost nobody truly heals properly within Gotham's endless darkness. Victor Freeze absorbed all of this over time, and the city shaped his transformation long before the accident froze his body physically. There is something deeply symbolic about Mr. Freeze existing specifically within Gotham, because his entire identity reflects emotional conditions the city creates constantly: coldness, isolation, preservation of trauma, emotional numbness replacing warmth. A man trapped permanently inside the worst moment of his life because the surrounding world offered no safe path toward healing. Gotham created those emotional conditions, and then Gotham feared the monster emerging from them afterward. That pattern repeats endlessly throughout Batman's world. The city harms people, abandons them, then acts shocked when they return transformed by suffering. Even Batman understands this truth sometimes. Batman often views Mr. Freeze with pity precisely because Bruce Wayne recognizes how many moments existed where Victor's tragedy might have unfolded differently if Gotham's institutions were less corrupt and emotionally indifferent. If GothCorp valued human life above ownership, if medical systems prioritized compassion over profit, if Victor received emotional support before obsession consumed him. If society responded to his transformation with understanding instead of fear, any one of these changes might have altered the future dramatically. But Gotham rarely provides such mercy, and perhaps that is what makes the city itself feel almost haunted. Gotham does not simply contain villains. It manufactures them slowly through corruption, greed, violence, and emotional neglect. The city functions like an enormous machine, grinding wounded people deeper into despair until some eventually emerge transformed into symbols of their suffering. Mr. Freeze became one of those symbols. Not greed, not chaos, not ambition, suffering itself frozen into physical form. And unlike villains who seem empowered by their transformations, Victor Freeze appears diminished by his constantly. There is no joy inside Mr. Freeze, no excitement, no emotional freedom. His crimes often feel exhausting even to him because he exists trapped inside endless grief without escape. That is why his story feels less like the rise of evil and more like the collapse of a damaged human being beneath unbearable emotional pressure. Still, Gotham continues creating similar tragedies repeatedly because the city never truly changes at its core. Wealth remains disconnected from suffering, institutions remain corrupted. Vulnerable people continue falling through cracks no one powerful enough truly cares to repair. And so the cycle continues, one broken soul after another, one tragedy after another, one villain after another emerging from pain left untreated too long. Victor Freeze simply became one of the saddest examples, because unlike many Gotham villains, the humanity inside him never fully disappears. Beneath the armor, the cold breath, and the frozen crimes remains the memory of a quiet scientist who once wanted nothing more than to preserve the woman he loved from death. That memory makes everything more tragic, because it reminds audiences that Mr. Freeze was not born monstrous. He was shaped slowly through grief, obsession, corporate exploitation, emotional isolation, and a city incapable of protecting fragile people before they shattered completely. And perhaps somewhere beneath Gotham's endless snowfall and pale glowing lights, Victor Freeze remains another victim wandering through the darkness, not innocent, not forgiven, but still undeniably shaped by a city that has always known how to turn human suffering into monsters better than almost anywhere else in the world. The quiet stillness of Mr. Freeze. Among all the enemies who have crossed paths with Batman throughout the endless darkness of Gotham City, few leave behind the same quiet sadness as Mr. Freeze. Because when most people look at Gotham's villains, they often see chaos, violence, cruelty, or madness first. Yet when they look at Victor Freeze carefully, they see something else hidden beneath the frozen armor and glowing blue light. They see grief that never ended, and perhaps that is what makes his story linger so painfully, long after the battles themselves are over. Because Mr. Freeze does not feel like someone who truly lives anymore. He feels like someone emotionally trapped between the memory of love and the numbness created by losing it. Gotham contains many monsters, but Victor Freeze often resembles less a predator stalking the city and more a ghost wandering through endless winter, unable to move beyond the worst moment of his life. That stillness surrounds him constantly. Unlike villains who fill Gotham with noise, laughter, speeches, or theatrical violence, Freeze often moves through silence. His laboratories hum softly beneath layers of ice and refrigeration, while frozen air drifts through empty corridors. Conversations with him rarely feel emotional in ordinary ways. There is exhaustion in his voice, distance, a strange calmness shaped by years of suffering too deep to express fully anymore. And somewhere beneath all that coldness remains the memory of Nora Freeze. Everything always returns to Nora. That is the heartbreaking center of Victor's existence. Even after the crimes, the obsession, the corporate betrayal, the transformation of his body, and the endless battles with Batman, Nora remains emotionally connected to every decision Victor makes. She represents the last warmth he ever truly trusted before grief consumed his life completely. But over time, something tragic happened to that love. It stopped moving forward. Healthy love grows, changes, adapts, survives hardship, and allows people to continue living beside one another through time. Victor's love for Nora became frozen emotionally. He preserved it exactly as it existed before loss destroyed everything, and because of that, he trapped himself psychologically inside the past forever. That is the true horror surrounding Mr. Freeze. Not merely the cryogenic weapons or frozen crimes, but the idea of a man unable to survive emotionally without preserving yesterday forever. Victor cannot let go because letting go feels identical to death in his mind. If he stops preserving Nora, if he stops fighting, if he stops chasing impossible scientific hope, then he must finally confront the unbearable truth that the life he once loved already disappeared long ago. And he does not know how to survive that realization. So instead, he remains frozen emotionally beside memory itself. There is something deeply lonely about that existence. Not ordinary loneliness, the kind people feel during quiet nights or temporary separation from others. Victor experiences a far deeper isolation shaped by physical transformation, emotional exhaustion, and years spent disconnected from ordinary human life. He cannot touch warmth naturally anymore. He cannot live inside the world the way other people do. Every part of his existence reminds him constantly that he no longer belongs fully among humanity. And yet, despite all this numbness, he still feels love. That contradiction defines him. Mr. Freeze lives suspended between emotional extremes, not fully cold enough to stop caring, but too emotionally damaged to reconnect with life properly either. He remembers warmth vividly enough for the loss to hurt constantly, yet cannot truly return to it anymore. That creates enormous sadness within him, because memory becomes both comfort and torture simultaneously. Victor preserves Nora partly because he loves her, but also because she represents proof that warmth once existed in his life at all. Without Nora, without those memories, without the mission consuming him, Victor Freeze might collapse entirely into emptiness. The frozen chamber holding Nora becomes symbolic of this emotional reality. To outsiders, it looks like preservation technology protecting a dying woman, but emotionally, the chamber preserves Victor too. It allows him to remain connected to the past, rather than facing the terrifying silence waiting beyond grief if he ever truly accepts loss. And perhaps that is why Batman often sees Mr. Freeze differently from Gotham's other villains. Batman understands the danger of becoming trapped inside trauma, because Bruce Wayne himself lives dangerously close to that edge every night. Batman also built his identity around grief after losing his parents. He also transformed pain into purpose. The difference is that Bruce continues trying to protect others broadly, while Victor narrowed his emotional world until only Nora remained fully real. Still, Batman recognizes how tragic that isolation truly is. There are moments during their encounters where Bruce seems almost mournful while confronting Freeze, as though he understands that victory against Mr. Freeze never truly feels like defeating evil in the traditional sense. It feels more like watching a broken man sink deeper into sorrow each year without finding a way back toward humanity again. And perhaps no one understands that sorrow better than Victor himself. Somewhere inside the armor and cold machinery, fragments of the original Victor Freeze still survive. He remembers the quiet scientist Nora once loved. He remembers ordinary warmth. He remembers conversation, companionship, and hope before obsession consumed everything. That memory may be the cruelest burden of all, because it means Victor understands exactly what he lost. People who become completely monstrous often stop recognizing their own tragedy eventually. Mr. Freeze never fully reaches that point. His sadness remains visible precisely because part of him still remembers what happiness once felt like before it disappeared, and yet he cannot escape the cycle surrounding him. Again and again, Victor returns to preservation, research, isolation, and frozen silence, because he no longer knows how to exist emotionally outside those things. Grief became structure. Obsession became survival. Nora became both the reason he continues living and the reason he cannot truly heal. That emotional paradox traps him permanently. Even moments of success carry sadness afterward. If Nora awakens, emotional distance often remains between them because Victor changed too much. If scientific breakthroughs occur, they rarely erase the years of violence and isolation already shaping his identity. Even temporary happiness feels fragile, because Gotham's darkness always waits nearby, ready to pull damaged people back beneath the surface again. And so Mr. Freeze continues wandering through Gotham's endless winter, like someone caught between life and mourning forever. There is also something haunting about the way coldness functions within his story emotionally. Ice preserves beautiful things temporarily, but it also prevents them from growing or changing naturally. Victor preserved Nora because he feared loss, yet in doing so, he trapped both of them inside emotional stillness. That stillness spreads through every part of his life now. His laboratories remain silent. His movements remain controlled. His voice remains distant. Even his crimes often feel less like bursts of rage and more like exhausted rituals repeated endlessly because he cannot imagine another path forward anymore. The world around him keeps moving. Gotham changes. People live and die. Batman continues fighting, but Victor Fries remains psychologically frozen beside the same grief year after year. And perhaps that is why he feels like one of Batman's saddest enemies. Not because he is innocent. He is not because his actions are justified. They are not, but because beneath every terrible thing he has done remains the image of a man who loved someone so deeply that he destroyed himself trying to stop time from taking her away. That kind of tragedy feels painfully human. As night settles once more across Gotham City, snow drifts quietly through the dark streets while pale lights shimmer against frozen rooftops and silent windows. Somewhere far beneath the city's endless noise and corruption, inside a hidden chamber glowing cold blue beneath layers of frost and steel, Mr. Freeze stands motionless beside Nora's preserved chamber once again. The machinery hums softly around them. Ice gathers slowly across the glass, and beyond the frozen silence surrounding Victor Freeze, Gotham's endless night continues falling gently beneath the snow. And now, as the cold winds drift quietly across the rooftops of Gotham City, the long and tragic story of Mr. Freeze begins to soften into silence, no longer filled with alarms, frozen laboratories, or desperate searches for impossible cures, but fading gently into something quieter, like snow settling slowly over empty streets beneath pale midnight lights. The grief, loneliness, and love that shaped Victor Freeze no longer feel sharp or violent now, but distant and sorrowful, like old memories frozen carefully beneath layers of ice that time itself cannot fully erase. Somewhere far below Gotham's towering skyline, Victor still stands beside Nora's silent chamber, surrounded by the soft hum of cold machinery and drifting frost, holding on to the last warmth he ever truly knew, while the city above him continues moving through endless rain and shadow. And as the snow falls more softly across Gotham tonight, you can let the story grow quieter too, letting the frozen streets, distant lights, and cold night air slowly drift farther away, until only silence remains, calm, still, and gently fading into rest.